The news of this framework agreement between the United States and Iran has already swept the G7, which you see behind me in Evian. That is Lake Geneva. Of course, that is where the G7 leaders, including President Trump, will be gathering for 3 days. Yesterday night, already a reaction from the host. The French President Emmanuel Macron putting out a video message at midnight indicating that he welcomes what would be or should indicate the end of hostilities between the two sides, but also reiterating that the G7 wants to hear the details and the fallout from this deal. Also, there will be leaders representing the Arab world, including Qatar and the United Arab Emirates, as well as Egypt, around the table. He also put out a statement alongside Germany, Italy, and the UK, insisting that this is good news if a deal indeed is put to paper. But they also repeated that they must see the reopening unconditional of the Strait of Hormuz. Of course, that is critical for the global energy market. And the Europeans have insisted and reiterated that they will not, under any circumstances, pay in order to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. The other big question, and the Europeans also made it clear last night in anticipation to this G7 meeting, is what's actually going to happen with the nuclear program in Iran. The French president insisting that Iran must never have a nuclear weapon. At this point, it is unclear what are the details of this agreement landed by the U.S. and Iran, but this is going to dominate talks today. As you say, Maeve, we are expecting the president of the U.S. to arrive tonight. He will be greeted by the French president, and then there will be a working dinner connected to the geopolitics immediately at around 7:30 p.m. for the Europeans, certainly the European part of this G7, but also Canada and Japan. The focus is the implications on the energy market, but also knowing specifically what is in this agreement. At this point, there are more questions, of course, than answers.
Indeed, as you say, Iran to dominate those talks there in Evian. But what else, Maria, is on the agenda?
Well, yes, there's also a very geopolitical, we should say, G7. It is also going to be a difficult G7 for Emmanuel Macron, the host, because when you're the host, you have to rally everyone around you and you have to make sure there is unity around the G7. For diplomats that we spoke to with yesterday, they repeated that already the fact that President Trump is going to stay for 3 days indicate there could be a level of unity not seen in the G7 since his return. We should also note that on Wednesday, and that is a personal touch from President Emmanuel Macron, the U.S. president will also head to Versailles for a dinner. That was the way, perhaps, to keep him engaged for 3 days here. The big topic, of course, will be the war in Ukraine. For the Europeans, they say that this is an opportunity to really talk about the conditions for a real negotiation. But we have seen overnight another real pounding of Ukraine, including a cathedral in Kyiv. For the G7, there's also a question of technology when it comes to artificial intelligence. The CEOs of some of the major Silicon Valley companies, including OpenAI and Anthropic, with a ban over the weekend, shocking in the world of technology, from the U.S. government to non-nationals. Basically, a ban to use some of the top-tier technology from Anthropic to non-Americans will also feature in a working lunch. And then there's, of course, a question of geopolitical and geoeconomic imbalances. China very much in focus. For diplomats here, they repeat that they are not naive. The relationship between the United States and Europe, and therefore also a large part of the G7, has fundamentally changed, but they still insist the U.S. is a country that you simply cannot ignore. There is enormous diplomatic and military might behind President Trump. So in the areas in which you can work together to get agreements and get things going moving forward, you still need to engage with President Trump. Everyone else, the Europeans say they will push for their own interests.